What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to Guys That Magic. I'm going to be your host, Dave, and today I'm going to be taking you through a deck tech for the brand new spoiled favorite legendary creature of all time, and I know it's yours too. That is Flubs the Fool. So this is one of the new cards that's going to be coming out with Bloomborough, but this is actually the Buy a Box promo. So if you pick up a box from your LGS, you'll be able to get a copy of this card. Don't worry, there's probably going to be tons of these floating around as well, just because of how much of an oddball this commander is and how incredibly unique it is as well. So Flubs the Fool is green, blue, and red. For 3 mana, you get a legendary creature, Frog Scout. It is a 0/5 and says you may play an additional land on each of your turns. It also says whenever you play a land or cast a spell, draw a card if you have no cards in hand. Otherwise, discard a card. So this is an incredibly unique teamer commander that essentially wants us to be playing in top deck mode throughout the entire course of the game. So long as we don't have a hand whenever we play a land or we cast a spell, which is basically just whenever we play Magic, we're going to be drawing cards, and that is absolutely fantastic. The downside, of course, being is we just don't have any cards in our hand. So this deck is very, very strange. I was playing around quite a bit with a few different variations of Flubs the Fool, and essentially what I centered this deck more so around is going to be taking advantage of those additional lands per turn. A lot of landfall abilities, a lot of card draw as well. Landfall turns into card draw with our commander, thank you. And then the other big thing here being is just making sure that we don't have any cards in our hand so that we can really take advantage of that engine. One of the downsides of this card is if you do ever find yourself with only 2 cards in hand, it really stifles you where you're able to cast one, you have to discard the other, and then sadly, because you did have another card in hand, Flubs is not going to draw you a card. So there are a couple of weird interactions. This deck is one that I think is quite a bit of fun. I do not think that this deck is very friendly for newer players, though, just because there's a lot of weird sequencing that you have to be very mindful of in this deck. With that being said, though, we're going to go ahead and dive in. So the first group of creatures that I'm going to be talking about are essentially all going to be included in this deck because they allow you to play additional lands during your turn. Now, I know that the commander already allows us to do that. We can play 2 lands so long as Flubs is in play, but let's really dive into this. We're going to take advantage of it. That way we can drop 3, 4, 5 lands per turn and really be able to draw an absolutely just massive number of cards on that. So we do have Courser of Kruphix, which is 3 mana. It's a 2/4. It allows you to play with the top card of your library revealed, and you can play that top card if it's a land. It also has another ability, lands you control whenever they enter the battlefield, you'll be able to gain 1 life. The life gain here is kind of cute, but Courser of Kruphix is really powerful because this allows us to see the top card of our library and to know whether or not we're going to continue to chain. Also, being able to play lands from the top of our library is a very unique ability, and it works really well in this list because this now means that we don't have to be playing it just from our hand. It allows us to chain a little bit more effectively with our commander. Dryad of the Elysian Grove is 3 mana for a 2/4. You can play an additional land on each of your turns, and lands you control are every basic land type. That second line there is just kind of cute. Our mana base is going to be good enough to where we have access to all 3 colors pretty much consistently throughout the game, but being able to play that extra land, super powerful. Azusa Lost but Seeking, 3 mana for a 1/2. You can play 2 additional lands on each of your turns. Kind of the same thing that I mentioned about the previous cards. We like extra landfall triggers. Oracle of Moldiah is 4 mana for a 2/2. You can play that additional land on each of your turns. You play with the top card of your library revealed, similar to the Courser of Kruphix, and it says that you can play lands from the top of your library. So once again, excellent card here. Helps to just kind of make sure that the chain is continuing. Lastly included in this package, we do have Wayward Swordtooth. This is 3 mana for a 5/5. It does have Ascend, which is pretty easy to hit in this list. For those of you who aren't familiar, Ascend just means you have 10 permanents. That's wonderful because this and all of our lands are going to count up to that 10. You're going to be able to hit it very quickly. This card says that you can play an additional land on each of your turns, and it also says it can't attack or block unless you have the City's Blessing. Ultimately, I don't really care about that. It's just a 5/5. I do care about that extra land, though. Taking advantage of these lands, the next group of creatures, these are all going to be our landfall package. The first of which is kind of the king of landfall. This is Scoot Swarm, 3 mana for a 1/1. It's got landfall. Whenever a land enters battlefield under your control, you'll make a 1/1. However, if you happen to have 6 or more lands, you're actually going to make another copy of Scoot Swarm instead. This card gets out of control pretty much immediately. You're going to be chaining, putting in a ridiculous number of lands. It's not impossible for you to drop Scoot Swarm, and by the end of the turn, you have, like, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 more copies of Scoot Swarm already going. Spring Heart Nantuko is a new card for Modern Horizons 3, going to be making this list. It's 2 mana for a 1/1. This one's a little bit weird. So this one has a kind of a complicated landfall trigger, but essentially what this kind of dumps down to is if you play a land, you make a 1/1. And that's really what we want here. It's not as good as Scoot Swarm, but it is still going to be a wonderful way for us to get some token generation and maximize that land count. Avenger of Zendikar also here, 7 mana for a 5/5. Whenever ETBs, you're going to make a bunch of 0/1 plants equal to the number of lands you control, and then whenever a land enters play under your control, you'll put a +1/+1 counter on all of those plants. This helps you to build up a board and make that board really big, really fast. Phylith World Sculptor is 6 mana for a 5/5. This one says whenever it enters the battlefield, you create a 0/1 plant creature token for each basic land you control. So it's kind of similar to Avenger of Zendikar, but it's not quite as good. It does also have a landfall trigger here too, though, and that says whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you put 4 +1/+1 counters on target plant you control. So it doesn't make as many plants, but it does really help to boost those plants and make them absolutely just gigantic very, very quickly. Rampaging Baloths is 4 and 2 green. It's 6/6 with trample, and it says whenever a land enters play, you'll make a 4/4 green beast creature token. Another just one of those token generators that's kind of the theme with all of these creatures so far. We do have more landfall creatures in this kind of like second half of the package. These ones don't make additional creatures, so there's no token generation for at least creatures on these. They're not going to help you to just kind of like build up that massive board state, but they're generally just like good things to include in a landfall deck. So the first of which is Tireless Provisioner, 3 mana for a 3/2. It's got landfall. Whenever a land enters, you'll either make a food token or a treasure token. You can make whichever one is more relevant to you over the course of that game. Grazing Gladeheart, 3 mana for a 2/2. It's got landfall. Whenever a land enters, you'll gain 2 life. Nice little way for you to be able to just pad your life total, or just make sure that you're going to stay alive long enough for you to just kind of like have your engine start going. Geode Rager is 6 mana for a 4/3. This one does have first strike, so it's fairly decent in combat. And it also says whenever a land ETBs, you'll be able to go to each creature target player controls. So this is a fun little way for you to just make sure that your opponents are swinging, they have to be attacking, and they have to be attacking other opponents if possible. So it's a little bit of chaos factor here. It takes the heat off of your deck and really puts it on your opponents. So Hedron Crab, a single blue mana. This one has a landfall that says whenever a land ETBs under your control, target player puts the top 3 cards of their library into their graveyard. You're probably going to be targeting your opponents with this, but you'll see here in a little bit, there are some times where you may actually want to mill yourself. This works really well if you know the top card of your library with one of our other cards, and maybe you can't continue to chain. You can always mill some things over. Plus, there is like a little bit of a mill payoff that we'll get to later on. Ruin Crab, very similar. This one's a single blue mana. Also has a landfall trigger that's going to make people mill, but this one is specific to only opponents. So it's going to make all of your opponents mill 3 cards whenever a land enters play. This one is just straight up dedicated as just kind of like a put the pressure on your opponents, because they're going to start churning through their library very, very quickly. The last 2 landfall creatures that we have, the first of which is Spitfire Lagak. It's 4 mana for a 3/4. Whenever a land ETBs, it'll deal 1 damage to each opponent. A nice little way for you to just burn your opponents down. 1 damage at a time, not really a whole lot, but whenever you're playing 3 or 4 lands a turn, Spitfire can get really, really nasty. And then lastly, we have Tireless Tracker, 3 mana, 3/2. It's got landfall. Whenever land enters, you'll be able to investigate, so you can make a lot of clue tokens there. And then it also has a second ability that feeds into its first, of which whenever you sacrifice a clue, you'll put a +1/+1 counter on Tireless Tracker. So it's a cute little creature. It gets big pretty quickly, and then also helps you out with just clues and drawing. The next group of creatures that we're going to go into, these are just kind of like big, more so like oddball creatures. They do have a reason as to why it is they are included in this deck. The first of which here is Ashaya, Soul of the Wild, 5 mana. It is a legendary creature elemental. It's a star. Its power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control, which can get pretty large. And it also says that non-token creatures you control are forest lands in addition to their other types. This means all of your creatures that you are going to have ETB are also going to be lands. This allows you to get additional landfall triggers just from playing creatures, which is really nice. There are kind of a fun little other series of workarounds because they're going to be forests, which means that they're also going to be lands. So some spot removal becomes a little bit more difficult to use up against your creatures now. So it's a very weird card, but it provides a lot of just kind of like added complexity to this deck. Next up, we have Kadama of the East Tree, 6 mana for a 6/6. It's got reach, and then it has a really weird ability that works very, very well with this list. It says whenever another permanent enters the battlefield under your control, if it wasn't put onto the battlefield with this ability, you may put a permanent card with equal or lesser converted mana cost from your hand onto the battlefield. I'm going to explain more about why this card is included in this list a little bit later on. Just keep in mind that does trigger off of land. So if you play a land and you have a land in your hand, Kadama can actually grab that second land and put it into play. Wonderful with landfall triggers. Does some crazy shenanigans, but we'll get back to this card later on. The next two creatures are going to be big payoffs for us, as well as just kind of like to help accelerate us for really the late game. The first of which is Nyxbloom Ancient, 7 mana for a 5/5. It's got trample, and it says if you tap a permanent for mana, it produces 3 times of that mana instead. Wonderful ramp card here. All of your lands are now going to be tapping for 3 mana, possibly more. We'll get to that later on. But massive mana accelerant. Vorinclex, Voice of Hunger, is 8 mana for a 7/6. It's got trample. It says whenever you tap a land for mana, you add an additional mana of any type that land produced. And then it also says whenever an opponent taps a land for mana, that land doesn't untap during that controller's next untap step. So accelerates for you, limits what your opponents can end up doing, and then also it's stapled onto a really big threatening body. We have 2 final creatures in this list. These are just kind of like individual, unique weirdos, but they do work well here, and I wanted to make sure that we included them because they do provide like a little bit of an odd functionality that you don't typically see. The first of which here is Hazaret the Fervent. It's 4 mana for a 5/4. It's got Indestructible and Haste, but it cannot attack or block unless you have 1 or fewer cards in hand. In this list, that's actually not a problem. Hazaret, 4 mana for a 5/4 with Indestructible Haste. This thing is a beater. It'll get in. It'll cause some damage. It'll cause some havoc. The other reason why we want to include this, and actually the more important reason here, is we can pay 3 mana and discard a card to have Hazaret deal 2 damage to each opponent. That is so incredibly important because there are some awkward times where you might find yourself with 2 cards in your hand. That is the absolute worst for this deck because it's just kind of like going to completely shut off your turn. You'll cast one thing and then you won't be able to chain from there. So Hazaret does a wonderful job of making sure that once we have dumped our hand, we just don't have a hand anymore. And that's really where this deck wants to be playing. The other creature we're going to be including here, and feel free, you can comment your boos down below, but this is Thassa's Oracle. 2 blue for a creature that's a 1/3. We don't actually care about its power and toughness, though. It says whenever it enters the battlefield, you'll look at the top X cards of your library, where X is your devotion to blue. You'll put 1 of them onto the top of your library and the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. And if X is greater than or equal to the number of cards in your library, you win the game. All right, here's the thing. We are not a combo deck. We are not trying to cheat or take advantage of this. We are actually trying to Thassa's Oracle the good old-fashioned way of just chaining through our deck and drawing an absolutely ridiculous number of cards, thanks to our commander. Thassa's Oracle is a way for us to be able to just have a payoff or a little bit of a reward. If we do make it to the point where we don't have much of a deck left or no deck at all, Thassa's Oracle will win us the game. Aside from that, we're not doing like the demonic consultation route or anything crazy. We're not comboing here. We're trying to use this card fairly, if we can even say that. But that's going to do it for the creature package. Next up, we're going to go into instants and sorceries. I do have these grouped together just based off of theme. The first of these are going to be cards that are going to help us to get more lands in play. So we have Farseek, which is 2 mana. It's a sorcery. We can search our library for any land that has a basic land type aside from forest and put it onto the battlefield tapped and then shuffle. Rampant Growth, 2 mana for a sorcery. We look for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield. And then 3 Visits is 2 mana. We look through our library. Specifically, we have to find a forest card. This one does put it onto the battlefield untapped, though, so you can use that land right away. And then lastly, included in this package, we do have Growth Spiral. This is a green and a blue for an instant. You draw a card, and then you can put a land from your hand onto the battlefield. So this one does allow you to get that extra land in play, but this one is really nice. It is an instant, so you can keep this one up if your opponents do have something going on. Maybe take advantage of a landfall trigger on one of their turns instead. The next two cards I'm going to talk about, this is our board wipe package. The first here is Blasphemous Act. It is 9 mana, sorcery. It costs 1 less to cast for each creature on the battlefield, but it deals 13 damage to each creature. That'll be able to wipe the board, kill just about everything that your opponents are going to have. Keep in mind, this will kill your things too, so just as always with a board wipe, use it whenever you need it, but it sometimes is going to be a little bit awkward, especially in a list like this where you may not need it this turn, but you think, okay, well, I might need it next turn, but if I try to keep this around for next turn, I may have accidentally pitched it with my commander. So this deck is a little bit weird whenever it comes to reactionary spells, and I'm trying to limit them, but I mean, board wipes are still very important. We've got to have some, and Blasphemous Act makes the list here. The other board wipe that I'm including is a little bit more limited and a little bit more just odd in general. This is Bonfire of the Damned. This does have a mana value of XX and red. We're not going to dive into that. What we actually care about is this card has Miracle. Miracle says that you can cast this card for its Miracle cost whenever you draw it, if it's the first card that you drew this turn. So this allows us to potentially chain into this. We can use our commander to just kind of like top deck a lot of cards in this list. So hopefully Bonfire of the Damned being one of those cards that we can just like top deck into. If this is the first card that we drew this turn, this, instead of costing that XX red, costs just X and red. And it says it deals X damage to target player and each creature he or she controls. This is not a board wipe per se, but it is going to definitely just ruin one specific player's day. And generally speaking, whenever you do need a board wipe, it's probably because one player has kind of run away with things and you just need to be able to restabilize. This one also has that added upside of it's never going to kill your things, so that's really powerful. Up next, we have our single target removal, or spot removal. The first card here is Snap, 2 mana for an instant, return target creature to its owner's hand, and then you untap 2 lands. This card is fantastic in this list because it allows us to continue to do shenanigans with our lands. It gives us our mana back. It's essentially kind of like a pseudo-free spell after we've cast this. Now, it is only bouncing something, so they are going to be able to get that creature back into play later on, but it is going to be able to at least delay them. Reality Shift, 2 mana for an instant. You're going to exile target creature, but they're going to be able to manifest the top card of their library, so they're going to replace it with a 2/2. Rapid Hybridization and Pongify are both included in this list. 1 blue mana for an instant. You're going to destroy target creature, but they're going to get a 3/3 out of it. So same kind of thing. They're going to replace their creature with another body, but in this case, you are destroying, so their problematic creature hopefully will go to the grave. Beast Within is 3 mana for an instant. This one you can destroy any permanent, however, the opponent will get a 3/3 out of it. Generally speaking, I mean, we don't care about the tokens that we're going to give our opponents. Whatever we needed to blow up is going to be much more problematic than the token that we give them. And then the last couple of instants and sorceries, these are going to be some of our larger payoffs. These are going to be some of the cards that are just going to hopefully help us to win the game on the spot, should we be able to cast these. The first of which is World Soul's Rage. This is X, a red, and a green for a sorcery. It deals X damage to any target, and then you can put X land cards from your hand and or graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. That's going to be a lot of landfall triggers. It's going to be a lot of damage, hopefully, that you can deal to just an opponent, or I guess if you really need to, if there's a problematic creature, you can deal with this. With this card as well. But this is going to be a wonderful card. When you play this deck, you're going to notice that a lot of your lands are going to end up to the graveyard just because you're going to be pitching them with your commander. But this will allow you to grab all those lands, put them right back onto the battlefield. Return of the Wild Speaker is 5 mana for an instant. You either draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control, or non-human creatures you control get +3/+3 until end of turn. This works really well with any kind of like go wide strategy, which turns out our landfall package has a lot of go wide included in it, and they're all non-humans. So this is going to be able to pump up all those little 1/1s or whatever it is that you had going on to be 4/4s or potentially even bigger. Return of the Wild Speaker should hopefully just win you the game. The other card here is Drown in Dreams. This is X, 2, and a blue. It's an instant, and it says if you control your commander, you can choose both modes instead of just one. It says target player draws X cards and target player mills twice X cards. This card is kind of funny because you may actually want to use both modes on an opponent. Just dump a ton of mana into this thing and then watch your opponent's library just be eviscerated. Milling your opponents to death is actually a win condition for this deck. So Drown in Dreams has a little bit more flexibility there. Moving on, we're going to talk about some of our artifacts. To start this off, we have our Artifact Just Ramp package. These are going to be all of our little mana rocks. We've got Soul Ring here, Arcane Signet, Fellwar Stone, Mind Stone, And I'm also going to be putting in all 3 of the talismans of this color combination. So that being Talisman of Impulse, Talisman of Curiosity, and Talisman of Creativity. These are not lands, but I am addicted to having mana ramp in my decks in the form of artifacts. I just love the way that they can accelerate things. I love that all of these are only 2 mana, and they provide a lot of flexibility. I am also going to be putting in a Chromatic Lantern in this list. 3 mana. It says lands you control can tap for 1 mana of any color, and then this, of course, can do that as well. But Chromatic Lantern helps us to make sure that our mana base is nice and smooth, and we have access to all of our colors. The next couple of artifacts we're going to talk about, and just to wrap up the artifact package as a whole, these cards are going to be a little bit more just odd. They provide more functionality for the deck in a different avenue. The first of which is going to be Sensei's Divining Top. This is a single mana for an artifact. You can pay 1 mana to look at the top 3 cards of your library, and then you can put them back in any order. So this is kind of nice. It allows you to be able to predict what you're going to be doing or set things up for your commander. That way we can chain, maybe draw a card, draw a card, draw a card. It's pretty nice. Plus, the second ability here with Sensei's Divining Top is that you can tap it to draw a card and then put Sensei's Top back on top of its owner's library. That gives you that predictable sense. You know what's going to be coming, and Sensei's Top costing only 1 mana means it should be very easy for us to chain this card. That way we replace Sensei's Top with the top card, put Sensei's Top on top, we'll play whatever the top card was, and then we'll just draw Sensei's Top. And for 1 more mana, we can just continue to do this. It allows us to draw a lot of cards over the course of a game and cast a lot of spells. Gear per Orrery is 4 mana for an artifact. This one says that each player may play an additional land on each of their turns, and at the beginning of each player's upkeep, if that player has no cards in hand, that player draws 3 cards. This one is a little bit of an oddity. I know we don't necessarily want to be drawing a ton of cards in this deck, and at least not putting them into our hand, but it is pretty powerful there. We are going to be rewarded a lot because we're not going to have any cards in our hand. Just keep in mind, this is going to require a little bit of sequencing for you to be able to pull this one off successfully, and you are going to be helping your opponents out. If you are more of an experienced player and you kind of just like know the ins and outs of this, this is a card that I do really like in this deck. But if you are somebody who is newer to Magic, or maybe just kind of like playing around with this deck for the first couple of times, this may actually be a card that you may just want to cut, just because of the complexity that this card adds whenever it comes to sequencing. Conduit of Worlds is 2 and 2 green for an artifact. You can play lands from your graveyard. That's going to be super powerful. We're constantly pitching things to our graveyard, but even more powerful than that, we can tap it and choose target non-land permanent card in our graveyard. If you haven't cast a spell this turn, you may cast that card. If you do, you cannot cast any additional spells this turn, and you activate it only as a sorcery. Conduit of Worlds allows us to be able to get some of our things back from the graveyard. Now, yes, it does shut us down as far as like anything else we could potentially do that turn, but having both of those options, being able to get our lands back and then be able to potentially return some of our problematic cards is really powerful. I like Conduit of Worlds a lot in this list. The last artifact here is Blackblade Reforged. This is 2 mana for a legendary artifact equipment. It says that the equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each land you control. You can throw this onto your commander for 3 mana, or you can throw this onto any non-legendary creature for 7 mana. It just turns whatever creature that you equipped on into an absolute giant beatstick, especially considering we're going to be playing an absolute just like massive number of lands per turn. Moving over to our enchantment package. Our enchantment package is kind of broken up into a couple of different subcategories. The first category that I'll go over is just like play additional lands. So here we do have cards like Case of the Locked House. It's 4 mana for an enchantment case. The first thing here it says is that you can play an additional land on each of your turns. That's honestly probably just like my favorite part of all of this. To solve it, it says that you control 7 or more lands. Once again, that's very, very easy to do in this list, so you'll be able to solve this almost immediately. And then once you have solved it, you can look at the top card of your library, and you can play lands and cast creatures and enchantment spells from the top of your library. This allows us to just continue to chain things together with our commander. Druid class is 2 mana for an enchantment class. This one says whenever land ETBs, you'll gain a life. That one's cute, but what I really care about here is actually the second level on this. So if you pay 3 mana, you can move it up to level 2. And this also adds extra text to the card where it now says that you may play an additional land on each of your turns as well. It does have a 3rd level here for 5 mana. You can bump it up, and at that point, whenever it becomes that 3rd level, target land you control will become a creature with haste, and this creature's power and toughness are each equal to the number of lands you control. This is a cute ability. It'll turn one of your lands into a big beater, but honestly, I'm more interested in the first 2 modes of this card. Lastly, for our enchantment kind of like put extra lands into play package. We have Exploration, 1 mana, and it just says you can play an additional land on each of your turns. So yeah, 1 mana, play 2 lands per turn, and then just go crazy. The next 2 enchantments here are going to be landfall enchantments, the first of which is Retreat to Coral Helm. This is 3 mana. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, you may either tap or untap target creature, or you can scry one. You can use this ability multiple times per turn because you're probably going to be dropping in multiple lands over the course of a turn. So scrying a bunch is really powerful. That helps to make sure that we're continuing to chain. And then also tapping or untapping target creatures. This means we can really be interfering with our opponents. Zendikaros Royal is 5 mana for an enchantment. Whenever our land ETBs, you'll make a 2/2 green elemental creature token. Another way for us to make a ton of creatures. Make sure that our board state just kind of gets flooded and that we're difficult to attack into, while also having plenty of creatures for us to attack our opponents with. The next group of enchantments, these ones are a little bit weird. They're going to be, honestly, I feel like very unique to this style of deck where we don't want any cards in our hand, but we still want a lot of like deck manipulation. So the first card here is Abundance. This is 2 and 2 green for an enchantment. It says if you would draw a card, you may instead choose land or non-land, and you reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a card of that chosen kind. You put the card into your hand and put all the other cards revealed this way onto the bottom of your library in any order. This just kind of guarantees you're going to draw what you want to be drawing into, and especially in a deck like this where you can use Abundance's ability multiple times per turn because your commander is going to have you draw so many cards. It's a really cool way for you to just like guarantee that you're chaining. Case of the Crimson Pulse is an enchantment case for 3 mana. This says whenever it enters the battlefield, you discard a card and then draw 2 cards. It's a cute little filtering ability there, but it says to solve it, you have to have no cards in hand. Well, the wonderful thing here being is that's kind of the point of our deck. Once this card has been solved, it says at the beginning of your upkeep, you discard your hand and then draw 2 cards. This card actually works out really well. Now, I've talked in the video about how having 2 cards in your hand can be kind of dangerous if you find yourself in that state. You still draw a card, so you'll actually still get 3 cards in your hand. You'll get 2 from the case, and then you'll get a 3rd card from just like your normal card draw, your draw step. So this is just straight gas. This allows you to just make sure that you are drawing ludicrous numbers of cards, keeping that engine going. Idle Thoughts is a very, very weird card, but we're including it here because it is actually really good with his commander. It is 3 and blue for an enchantment. It says you can pay 2, draw a card if you have no cards in hand. This works really well because if you do ever find yourself in that awkward situation of like you only had 2 cards in your hand at the beginning of your turn, you cast one, you have to pitch the other, and then all of a sudden your engine has puttered out. Idle Thoughts says, nope, it doesn't have to putter, just pay 2, you'll draw another card, and then past that point, you're just going to start chaining. This guarantees that your commander is just going to go absolutely nuts, so long as you can pay 2, but realistically speaking, I mean, your deck should be able to pay 2. Lastly, here we have Rites of Flourishing. This is 2 and a green for an enchantment. At the beginning of each player's draw step, that player draws an additional card. And it also says that each player may play an additional land on each of their turns. I'm mainly here for that second portion. I like the extra land drop. This is another one of those cards where, as I've mentioned, you can find yourself in a trap with having 2 cards in your hand. Idle Thoughts comes in really well here, but this is another card that if you want to play around with it, you want to have that high risk, you can play with this. But if you don't, or if you're not somebody who's really good whenever it comes to like sequencing your turn, you can take Rites of Flourishing out of this deck. You're not going to hurt my feelings by dropping this card. The last 2 enchantments that I have here, the first of which is Mana Reflection, 6 mana for an enchantment. If you would tap a permanent for mana, it produces twice as much of that mana instead. This is going to just make sure that we have access to, well, a lot of mana. Hopefully be able to pump a lot into those X spells, or just make sure that we can hit some of our more expensive drops more consistently. And then also Underworld Breach. This is 1 and a red for an enchantment. Each non-land card in your graveyard has escape, and the escape cost is equal to the card's mana cost, plus exile 3 other cards from your graveyard. You do also have to sacrifice Underworld Breach at the beginning of the next end step, but this is a really powerful card. It allows us to be able to recast some of the things from our graveyard that we have pitched over the course of the game. So don't worry if you found yourself in a situation where you're like, ah, man, I've got to discard my Avenger of Zendikar because I just don't have another option. There are ways to be able to get those cards back. Moving on, we're going to jump into the land package for this deck. I do have 3 lands that can tap for any color in our commander's color identity. Obviously, we're going to be throwing in Command Tower here. We're also going to be throwing in Ketria Triome. This is the Triome. It's a forest, land, and mountain. It can tap for green, blue, or red, or you could cycle this away for 3, and this will ETB tapped. Frontier Bivouac enters the battlefield tapped, and it can tap for 1 of each color for our commander's color identity as well. I'm going to be putting in all 3 of the bond lands here. So that's going to be Rejuvenating Springs, Spire Garden, and Training Center. They enter the battlefield tapped unless you have 2 or more opponents, which in a game of Commander you probably will. And they can tap for 2 different colors respectively. I'm going to be putting in 2 of the temples here, so this being both Temple of Abandon and Temple of Mystery. They enter the battlefield tapped. When they enter the battlefield, though, you're going to scry 1, so this is kind of important. This deck does care a lot about that top deck manipulation, so I do like these here. Temple of Abandon taps for either a red or a green, and Temple of Mystery will tap for either a green or a blue. I'm also going to be putting in 2 of the bounce lands. This is going to be Gruul Turf and Simic Growth Chamber. They enter the battlefield tapped, and whenever they enter the battlefield, you return a land you controlled back to its owner's hand, and then they can tap later on for 2 colors. So Gruul Turf can tap for both a red and a green, and Simic Growth Chamber will tap for both a green and a blue. Now, the reason why I really like these cards in this list is because you can actually choose this land as the target of that bounce. So if you play Gruul Turf, it wants to bounce a land back to your hand. You can say, I'm going to bounce Gruul Turf, and then you can play Gruul Turf again and bounce it again, and play it again and bounce it again. So this is a way for us to really be able to take advantage of those like play extra land abilities in any kind of landfall. If we can play 5 lands per turn, we can play Gruul Turf 5 times. It guarantees us that we have that land drop. There's also some really kind of crazy shenanigans that you can do with these 2 cards specifically, and then one of the creatures that I talked about earlier. So let's go ahead and pull this one back up, and that's going to be Kadama of the East Tree. Kadama of the East Tree, like I mentioned, whenever you play a land, it can put another land from your hand directly into play. If you play, for example, Gruul Turf comes in and it wants to bounce a land, you can bounce itself, and then Kadama says, wait a second, a land entered, I want to put another land from your hand into play. You can actually grab that Gruul Turf that you just bounced and put it into play. It's not going to count as you playing a land for turn. It's just going to cheat it into play with Kadama. This does actually create an infinite loop. Just keep in mind, you do have to have another land in your hand in order for you to stop this, because at a certain point, it's just going to get crazy. If you only have the bounce land, you're just like going to continue and continue and continue. But if you do have any of your landfall creatures in play, that means infinite landfall triggers. Ruin Crab or Hedron Crab, you're going to mill your opponents out. They're just going to lose the game there. Or any of our token producers, you're just going to go absolutely crazy with. You're going to make a trillion creatures or whatever, just arbitrary like large number you want to choose. So these lands are really, really cool in this list. I've got 2 shocks here. I've got both Breeding Pool and Stomping Ground. Enter the battlefield tapped unless pay 2 life. We can tap for 1 of 2 different colors respectively. I've got all 3 of our slow lands here. So Dream Root Cascade, Rockfall Vale, and Storm Carved Coast. They can tap for 1 of 2 different colors respectively. And they say that they enter the battlefield tapped unless you control 2 or more other lands. So great in the mid to late portions of the game. I do have 2 we're going to go with like pseudo fetch lands here. One actually is a fetch. The other one is just kind of like a I'll say it's a fetch. It's just not like what we typically think of when we say fetch. So the first one here is Wooded Foothills. This is Shane's favorite fetch land. It's a land that you can tap it, pay 1 life, sacrifice it, search your library for a mountain or forest, put it directly onto the battlefield. This is a way for you to be able to just get 2 landfall triggers over the course of a single turn, as well as just kind of like thinning your deck and making sure that you have access to all the colors of mana that you need. Fabled Passage is a land that you can tap, sacrifice, search your library for a basic land card, put it on the battlefield, tap, and then shuffle. And then, of course, if you do control 4 more lands, you untap that land. So a nice little extra like payoff here for those landfall triggers. I have all 3 of the check lands. This is going to be Hinterland Harbor, Rootbound Crag, and Sulphur Falls. They enter the battlefield tapped unless you have a land of 1 of 2 different specific basic land types. And then each of these lands can tap for 1 of 2 different colors of mana, respectively. I've got all 3 of the Pain lands included here, so Karplusan Forest, Shivan Reef, and Yavimaya Coast. You can tap it for a colorless if you'd like to, or you can tap it and have it add 1 mana of 2 different colors to your mana pool, but it'll deal 1 damage to you if you do. Honestly, these are fantastic cards in the beginning of the game because you can guaranteed pretty much get the mana color that you need, and then in the later portions of the game, whenever maybe you're casting a spell that's like, a red and a colorless, or a red and a generic, you can just use these to pay for that generic or the colorless cost. I do have 2 man lands that I wanted to put in here, the first of which is Lair of the Hydra. This one says, if you control 2 or more other lands, it enters the battlefield tapped, so obviously going to be better in the early portions of the game, but this is a land that can tap for a green, and in the later portions of the game when we have tons of mana, and we maybe don't have anything going on, anything that we want to just be able to, like, to cast, we can sink all that mana into this land by paying X and a green, and to make this an XX green Hydra creature until end of turn, so it'll just turn into a giant beast stick. The other one here is Restless Vinestalk. This card always enters the battlefield tapped. You can tap for a green or a blue. It says if you pay that 5 mana, it becomes a 5/5 green and blue plant creature with trample. It's still a land, and it says whenever it attacks, up to 1 target creature has base power and toughness 3/3 until end of turn. So it kind of like takes one of your opponent's creatures out of the equation. They can choose to block with it. That's cute. The 3/3 will die to the 5/5. If they end up blocking it, so that's kind of nice. I have one more non-basic land that I want to talk about, and that's going to be Undiscovered Paradise. This is a land that you can tap to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool, and it says at the beginning of your next untap phase, return Undiscovered Paradise to its owner's hand. So you'll play this, and then it will bounce itself back to your hand at the beginning of your next upkeep. This, once again, just another little like cute card. It guarantees that you get some landfall triggers into play. Just kind of, once again, keep in mind that a number of cards that you have in your hand can be a little bit funkier, a little bit odd. So this is another one of the cards that, like, it synergizes really well with landfall, and there are some times where you will definitely take advantage of this, but this card, if you sequence it incorrectly, or if maybe you don't count how many cards you're going to have in your hand, this can kind of stifle you a little bit. So use this card a little bit more sparingly. Lastly, we're going to dive into the basic lands for this list. I've got 8 basic forests, I've got 2 basic islands, and I have 3 basic mountains. That's going to do it for this, as just included in cards in general for this list. Now, before we wrap this up in total, however, I am going to give you one massive piece of advice, and that's what makes this commander so incredibly weird. We really want to be able to start the game with as few cards in our hand as we possibly can. That way Flubs can turn on as soon as Flubs drops. Now, here's the thing. There's actually this wonderful, I don't want to call it a mechanic, but just an aspect of the game where you can start the game with fewer than 7 cards in your hand. With Flubs, you're going to aggressively mulligan. Not to get a good hand, although that would help. You're going to aggressively mulligan to start the game with like 3 basic lands, or like just 3 lands, just enough to cast Flubs, because we don't care about anything past that point. We want us to be able to have no cards in hand as soon as we possibly can. So mulligan aggressively with Flubs, and it will reward you. Just make sure that your opponents don't kill Flubs, because if that is the case, well, then you've just pitched your hand and hopefully you're still in the game. But that's kind of the downside of playing around with this commander. This is more so just like, I feel like kind of like a meme commander that is a lot of fun. But I mean, keep in mind, this can go south really, really quickly. If you did like this deck tech, though, if you want to pick up these cards, they come up currently to $315, at least as of the time of this recording. I personally absolutely love Flubs. I think this deck is a ton of fun. If you like being able to just like chain things together, or if you like just having your opponents ask like cards in hand and you smile and you say 0, this is the commander for you. If you haven't done so already, please make sure that you like and subscribe to this video. Make sure that you follow us on our other social media platforms. We are on Instagram, TikTok, and also on X. At Guys That Magic. And aside from that, if you want to see more content, some exclusive goodies, we do have a Patreon. You can go ahead and find the link for the Patreon down below. Until next time, this has been Guys That Magic. Peace.